2,000 years ago, the courageous ancestors of these native Hawaiian children sailed north from the islands of Polynesia and discovered the beautiful land that today we call Hawaii. In the centuries that followed this discovery, the native Hawaiian people developed a thriving culture that was built around a reverence and attachment to the land.
In the Hawaiian concept of land is sacred, and land is a sacred ancestor and ancestress. And the land is not owned, but the people provide stewardship over the land.
Land was held communally. Really, it was viewed that the ali'i, or the ali'i moku, the highest chief, held the land in trust for the gods and for the benefit of the people. The Western system was very much oriented towards specific people owning specific parcels of land.
Land is a commodity to be bought and sold and possessed.
When that Western concept came into conflict with the Hawaiian ownership system, there was a great turmoil.
With great turmoil in Hawaii came immense pressure for the sale of lands to Westerners, and there was increased pressure to change the land tenure system.
This was a transcendent process trying to move lands from a traditional perspective of sharing to one more like the Western concept of land ownership. It's still an incomplete process, and that's the important thing to remember. It was clear when you look back at all the documents in 1846 starting this process that the common people, the maka'ainana, were to get 1/3 of the lands. But the implementation of that failed. And so since then, we've been trying to move some of that land back into the hands of the common Hawaiian people. The Hawaiian Homes Commission Act was a small step in that direction, but this effort is still very much unfinished.
Well, it really broke the sacred bond that Native Hawaiians had to the land, because now land became a commodity, something that could be bought and sold, rather than a sacred ancestor and ancestress. And it also physically separated most of the Hawaiians from the land, because as the lands that the chiefs got began to be sold to foreigners, and as part of the lands that the government got also were auctioned off and mostly went to foreigners, then the foreigners holding those lands began to evict Hawaiians from those lands. And as the Hawaiians themselves, who were protesting in 1845 in petitions to the king and the council, predicted, they said, you know, if you do this land ownership, then the Hawaiian people are going to end up as homeless people in our homeland.
We now turn to a video clip of Daviana from 1999, briefly highlighting a turning point in Hawaii's history.
In 1848, King Kamehameha III had set aside a total of 2.4 million acres for the Crown and the government. By the time that these lands were ceded by the Republic of Hawaii, it amounted to 1.8 million acres.
And these lands are the lands that we know today as the ceded lands. At the time of the overthrow in 1893, the provisional government said the government lands now belong to the provisional government and whatever entity is created.
Queen Liliuokalani protested the annexation. She never surrendered her claim to the ceded lands. Neither she nor her people were compensated for them.
2 years after the 1898 annexation, of Hawaii by the United States, Hawaii became a U.S. territory with the signing of the Organic Act.
During the kingdom period, the king had possession and managed the crown lands, which were about 1 million acres of land. And then there was another collection that started off at about 1 million acres, but came down to about 800,000 that was called the government lands. And the government lands were to be a resource for the government to draw upon. The crown lands supported the monarchy, which of course was exclusively a Hawaiian entity. Westerners had their eyes on these lands. Sanford Dole, when he was a young man, wrote that the crown lands should be transferred and sold. After the overthrow, when the Republic came in, the Republic mushed these two lands together, and just called them public lands. So the integrity of the Crown lands was lost during that period. And after annexation, the United States did the same thing when Hawaii was a territory. They simply treated these lands as public lands, but they didn't merge them with the entire public lands of the United States. They did appreciate that these were special lands to be held in trust. And as early as 1899, the U.S. Attorney General wrote that these lands were to be held in trust. The ceded lands are the Crown and government lands together. Okay. So the Republic of Hawaii, 1894, combined these in their constitution and tried to sort of sell some of them off, but by good fortune, the Crown lands were in long-term leases to the sugar plantation. So despite the efforts of the Westerners, they were unsuccessful in disseminating these lands. So they maintained their integrity and are still, for the most part, public lands. The government lands, some of those were transferred, but at the time of annexation, we still had 1.8 million acres that were the ceded lands, and these were 1 million Crown lands, 800,000 government lands.
I call these lands the Hawaiian national lands because these were the lands of the Crown lands, the King of Hawaii, and then also the lands that belong to the government of the Kingdom of Hawaii. So together, these are the Hawaiian national lands. Now, the provisional government then claimed these ownership over these lands, and so did the Republic, which succeeded it, did the same. And then at the time of annexation, the Republic turned over its claim to the federal government, the U.S. federal government, as part of annexation. And as John just said, the federal government did not put it into its inventory of lands. It continued to hold it as a public trust so that it had oversight over it and so-called ownership, which is still questionable. And then, but they also had the territory actually manage the lands day to day. In 1921, Prince Kuio, as delegate to Congress, went to Congress and said the Crown lands, which were the lands of the king and which should have rightfully been dispersed, to give a 1/3 to the people, should be set aside for Native Hawaiians to homestead because Hawaiians continued to decline in numbers, and he was afraid Hawaiians would become an extinct people. And he asked for these lands to be set aside, and Congress acknowledged a special trust relationship at that time to Native Hawaiians as indigenous people to Hawaii. And they set aside 200,000 acres of not only Crown land, but government land for Native Hawaiians to homestead. And then the rest of the lands were, some of them were used became national parks and some military lands. And then the rest was the territory used as its, territorial lands for different public works projects and education.
So that's very, very interesting because here we are looking for federal recognition, but it seems as if we had a limited amount of federal recognition at the time of the Hawaiian Home's creation.
Right, that's correct. Since 1921, the policy of Congress has been to recognize Hawaiians as indigenous people. That is the existing policy. What has to happen is for the Supreme Court to recognize that that's the policy. And because of the challenges, for Congress to reaffirm what is its existing policy.
By the late 50s, enthusiasm for statehood was building in the islands. As a condition of statehood, the Admission Act was drawn up. Section 5F of the Admission Act defined how the ceded lands were to be governed under the newly created state of Hawaii.
The majority of the ceded lands were ceded back to the state of Hawaii, but those ceded lands were impressed with a specific trust.
Section 5 governs the transfer of lands to the new state of Hawaii. And because the United States had understood these lands were held in trust throughout the territorial period, it reaffirms that in the Admission Act in 1959, and it says the state of Hawaii gets 1.4 million acres, but in trust. And it lists 5 purposes, and you saw on the screen the important one for the betterment of the conditions of Native Hawaiians. So this is once again, a clear recognition by Congress that Native Hawaiians are Native people, indigenous people with the same kinds of legal status that other Native and indigenous people have under U.S. law. And since then, the state in the next 2 decades failed to implement that responsibility and did not designate any of the revenues from those lands explicitly or directly for Native Hawaiians. Instead, almost all that money went to the Department of Education. In the 1978 Constitutional Convention, the delegates wanted to correct that error and passed a series of proposed a series of amendments that the voters then approved in the November 1978 election. They created the Office of Hawaiian Affairs. They changed the revenue stream formula to the Department of Hawaiian Homelands. And most significantly for us tonight, they said that the Office of Hawaiian Affairs was to get a pro rata share of the revenue from the ceded lands, from the Public Land Trust, for the purposes of the betterment of the conditions of Native Hawaiians. And so that then led to the implementation. The Office of Hawaiian Affairs came into being, and in 1980, the state legislature passed a law designating that the Office of Hawaiian Affairs should get 20% of the revenues from these public lands.
If we were to examine the history of these lands, we would also see that at the time that the Mahele was established, that the principles laid out that the Native Hawaiian people would have had a chance to separate out their claim in these lands, so that when these lands were established, the Crown lands and the government lands back in the Mahele, they all have a phrase that goes with in the law that sets these lands aside, which translated says, reserving only the rights of the Native Hawaiian people, the Kuaina, who live on these lands. And that meant that the people would have a chance to make a claim on these lands and also have a right to have access to these lands.
What's important is recognition that there are injustices that need to be dealt with and understood and rectified. I think back in the civil rights period in the 1960s where we came to realize that it was not a black versus white situation, but blacks and whites together against injustice. And I think the people of Hawaii, the non-Hawaiians, very much understand that the Hawaiian claim is just, it's long overdue, and we need to keep going forward to try to resolve it.
When we talk about the ceded lands, they comprise over 95% of all the lands that the state holds or owns, and they encompass a wide range. Schools, hospitals, conservation areas, agricultural lands, our harbors, our airports, those are on ceded lands. And the state receives income from those lands in a lot of different ways.
For more than 20 years after statehood, there were no payments made for that part of the Public Land Trust provision that was specifically designated for the betterment of the conditions of Native Hawaiians. In 1978, a constitutional convention was held.
The Hawaiian Affairs Committee recognized that there was an obligation on the part of the state because of the Admission Act to at least serve in part the purpose of the betterment of the conditions of Native Hawaiians.
The provision on the ceded lands had not been fully recognized, the public trust had not been acknowledged, and so OHA evolved out of that in a very timely way.
The Office of Hawaiian Affairs was created as a recipient for the ceded lands revenues. The legislature had the responsibility of determining what percentage of the ceded lands revenue would be appropriated for the Office of Hawaiian Affairs.
No one knew what the income was from ceded lands because the lump sum total of it had been taken into the budget and used for education up to that time. We initially looked at the pro rata share of the trust income from the ceded lands at a very low amount. I think the first bill we passed out of the Senate on OHA was for 5% of the ceded land income to go to OHA.
After a compromise, it was decided the percentage would be 20%. Beginning in 1981 through 1990, 20% of funds derived from ceded lands under the management of the Department of Land and Natural Resources was paid to OHA. While payments totaled some $14 million, it was less than the amount owed. Following the passage of Act 304, the state and OHA began a second series of negotiations that lasted some 30 months. This culminated in a payment of $136.5 million for lands not under the Department of Land and Natural Resources and included interest on past due amounts owed. However, this amount was still less than the total retroactive payment owed of $141.8 million. In 1993, President Clinton signed the Apology Law. This joint resolution of Congress apologizes to Native Hawaiians for the overthrow of the Kingdom of Hawaii. The Apology Bill states that Hawaiians never relinquish their claims to their inherent sovereignty as a people or over their national lands to the United States.
As part of our compact with the United States, when we became a state, we took on this trust responsibility towards Native Hawaiians. And it's important that the state live up to that trust responsibility, not only for Hawaiians, but for its people as a whole.
We actually took up the issues that were unfinished from 1993, which were the disputed revenue issues. And collectively, the Office of Foreign Affairs, our trustees, working with the executive branch, culled through all the details and the facts and what was presented earlier from Professors McGregor and Van Dyke, and worked very diligently and not letting any detail slip.
What happened in 2001 was the Hawaii Supreme Court came back in what we call the OHA 1 decision, and it held that Act 304 was invalid. Because in the intervening time, in 1997, there was a federal congressional act called the Forgiveness Act. And it basically said that airport revenues cannot be used to pay the Office of Hawaiian Affairs. Because airport revenues, they said, could only be used for airport purposes, and this isn't an airport purpose. And since the Forgiveness Act was inconsistent with or in conflict with Act 304, the Hawaii Supreme Court said, okay, Act 304 is invalidated, which means that we went right back to the prior statute that the Hawaii Supreme Court said was unambiguous and unenforceable.
Yeah.
And that's where we were. The unfortunate thing about this 2001 decision, the OHA 1 decision, is that then Governor Cayetano used it to reduce OHA's income, annual income, it went from 15 million a year to 0, okay? And that was a very aggressive position, anti-Hawaiian position that he took. And it wasn't until Governor Lingo took office, where by executive order in 2003, she upped the amount from 0 to 9 million. With the passage of Act 178, the legislature approved going back to 15.1 million. But in that intervening time, there was an OHA 2 decision where the Office of Hawaiian Affairs, with myself and Justice Robert Klein as the lawyers, sued the state of Hawaii for bringing about the Forgiveness Act and trying to get all that money back. And basically what the Hawaii Supreme Court said in the OHA 2 decision in 2006 was, go back to the legislature. It's for them to resolve. But this time it told the legislature, you have a constitutional obligation to resolve this. The settlement has two components. There is a past due component, and basically that's the 200 million you're talking about. And the 200 million are for those three disputed amounts: Waikiki duty free, state hospitals, Hawaii Housing Authority, and the interest on those. And the components of that are these land parcels that you see on the graphic, and then the balance of 13 million cash. OHA is the only one releasing anything, and OHA is releasing its right to income and proceeds under the Constitution for the period 78 to 2008. And the important part of this release is it does not affect Native Hawaiians' right to create a Native Hawaiian governing entity to seek title to the ownership of the ceded lands, basically the overthrow claim. Okay, so that's the past due part of the settlement. The going forward part of the settlement is that because the remaining statute 10-13.5 was unenforceable, unusable, and not valuable anymore, we replaced that with a minimum of $15.1 million a year. We can't sue for any more per year, but we can lobby the legislature for more if circumstances warrant it. Well, what we learned was that, through the initial, 20% of the funds from the Public Land Trust, and then Act 304, 20% of the revenues for the Public Land Trust, and try and define revenues. If there's any ambiguity, the Office of Hawaiian Affairs is going to be the one that loses. And so what we tried to do this time is let's be certain. I mean, the 15.1 million per year is a really fair amount. It's got historical significance. Let's agree on that.
In this negotiation, we needed to find lands that could be culturally developed, but would also provide a meaningful economic base for OHA, for all of the programs that OHA funds, whether they're scholarships, health programs, public service
Sustainability
programs.
models.
Yes, exactly. So that was how we developed a list of possible state lands. We looked at all 10,000 TMKs the state owned and ended up selecting a number of them for consideration by the administration. We came down to these three. And I think there are some slides. Kaka'ako Makai is the first of the three parcels. It's a waterfront commercial property, 18.5 acres, that goes along the Ewa side of Kiwalo Basin, including an interior parcel from there, more Ewa from there. And one of the important things that the trustees did as the settlement process was considered was they affirmed that they're not going to develop any of these parcels just on their own in a closed-door session. They're going to actually consult with Native Hawaiians and other stakeholders for all of these areas before making any plans for these parcels.
Now we continue to the next parcel. We go to the further west.
Yeah, it's just Makai of Campbell Industrial Park along the ocean, a really beautiful 110 acres of land. For Kalailoa, there's no lessees, and we're just starting to look at these parcels and trying to understand them. We do know it's part of this band on the south shore of Oahu that has the highest solar energy potential on the island of Oahu.
An interesting piece that came up, the Hilo Banyan Drive. Is that where the Naniloa is?
Yes.
The Naniloa Hotel?
That's exactly it. It's the Naniloa and 5 other resort/condo properties along Banyan Drive in Hilo. It's about 80 acres of land, includes a golf course and those 6 properties. It's completely developed for hotel uses. The state has looked at all 3 of these parcels over the years and recognized they have important values for everybody, and we think that we can help realize those values for ourselves and for everybody by getting title to these lands and redeveloping them in a culturally sound way that does also produce revenue for our beneficiaries.
Let me add something here too, Rickwood. The Board of Trustees has adopted a real estate policy, vision, mission, and strategy. And really it is in that context that we look at from here on out how we acquire, buy, come into the land holdings for the Office of Foreign Affairs.
What about the cash? There is $13 million in cash in the settlement. How was that arrived at, Bill?
Well, that was the balance after the land values.
The
land values were based on the recent tax assessed values. And so once the land was identified, the balance.
Or the balance of $200 million.
Yeah, we arrived at $200 million first and then worked backwards.
But worked backwards?
Yeah.
I see. And you took the current values of the land?
Current tax assessed values.
Tax assessed values of the land. Please explain why $200 million is a sufficient amount for Native Hawaiians.
Well, Brookwood, it's fair for also the state of Hawaii. It's not just sufficient for Native Hawaiians. The state of Hawaii was represented by, personally, Attorney General Mark Bennett, who was a very good commercial litigator, and he was involved every step of the way. So it's a fair amount from both sides. But from the Native Hawaiian perspective, I think you have to go back and look at what we're resettling. We're settling those disputed claims that we were unable to resolve with the Waihee administration back in 1993.
The disputed amounts is much higher than the undisputed back from 1993 here now in 2008. But as Bill has described, with time passing, legislators and administrations changing, viewpoints about entitlements or obligations to Native Hawaiians, though in the Constitution, implementing those obligations. Sometimes you're having to be more persuasive than at other times, and I think this was the right time to move, and the action taken by our Board of Trustees, along with the executive branch, evidences that this is the right time, and we're hoping now that the legislature will help all of us collectively fulfill this obligation.
I'm Brickwood Galateria, your host this evening. We learned and listened. Office of Hawaiian Affairs, mahalo for your joining us here this evening, and I believe Auntie Gladys Brandt takes us home.
Fairness and decency are not extraordinary requests coming from the descendants of the first citizens of Hawaii. Let us work together to undo the injustices of the past, to restore what is right, and to build a future together that we can all share with pride and dignity. In this special place that we call Hawaii, in this special land of exceptional beauty that has welcomed all of us, let us embrace and nurture the native Hawaiian value of aloha that has become the defining identity for all the citizens of our state.